Good afternoon. We are in Senate Institutions on Wednesday, January 15th, 2025. Thank you for being here. Today we have first the staff from Department of Finance and Management to talk about the capital bill, which is one of the major responsibilities of this committee. Let's introduce ourselves as a committee before we go further.
Senator Russ Ingles, Essex District.
Senator Joe Major, Windsor District.
Senator Rob Plunkett, Bennington District, and Vice Chair.
And we have Committee Assistant Linda Lehman and Wendy Harrison, Chair.
Senator Sam Douglas from Orleans District, and Clerk.
And Clerk. Yes, congratulations.
That's a hard fought battle. Always. I got through it in the end.
And we appreciate it.
I had faith in you.
Yeah.
From the beginning.
And there is training available if you need it, but I don't think you're going to need it. Okay. So let us get started. So, Nick Kramer, you get first.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. If it works for the committee, I'd like to bring Will up in here. We can just
Sounds good.
double up here. So for the record, Nick Kramer, Chief Operating Officer of the Agency of Administration. Here with my colleague.
Hello, I'm Will Anderson. I'm a budget analyst with the Department of Finance and Management, also part of the administration agency.
Great, thank you. And congratulations on your promotion.
Thank you. As well. Chair Harrison and Senator Ingles will recall my face from last year. I was in this committee a lot, serving in Will's role. So we've had some staffing transitions in the Agency of Administration. Excited to be here sort of as point person on the capital bill. Appreciate the time to speak with you all. I don't want to cover anything that is repeat information at this point. So I guess I would defer to you, Madam Chair, in terms of what you all have had in terms of capital budgeting 101. I'm prepared to talk pretty broadly to any number of topics. And talking points are loosely around the CDAC process and general obligation borrowing writ large, the process where the administration comes in, where the legislature has come in, and then got some points to touch on the cash fund, which I
Terrific.
does that sound?
That sounds great. And we have just had a brief walkthrough of the bill as a spreadsheet and the text of the bill.
Okay.
We haven't really talked about the CDAP, so that would be very helpful. The treasurer's going to be here next week.
Great.
Discuss that.
So
Thank
I'll try to tee things up. So as this committee probably at this point knows, our capital budget historically has been funded through the issuance of general obligation debt, or borrowing on the state side. We issue GO bonds largely to fund our capital projects. The rationale historically for doing that, there's a multi-generational equity argument that if you're building a capital asset, which is defined per accounting standards as anything that has a usable life of 20 years or more, that's an enduring asset that future generations will be enjoying. And so it's an appropriate time to bond, to issue debt that will then be paid off by those future generations who are enjoying the capital asset. I always put in a personal plug as a sort of younger member of the world that I think there's plenty of bills to pay down the road for our younger generations. And I think that multi-generational argument is important and is best situated in a more complex framework. I think there are lots of good reasons to borrow, and there are also lots of good reasons to think about alternatives to borrowing, which is something we'll be touching on here. But historically, for the last 30 years or so, the capital budget, which is the jurisdiction of this committee and the House Corrections and Institutions Committee, has been entirely funded through bonding. So the totality of projects are approved, authorized in this committee, and then as departments go out and actually spend on those projects, the state goes out and bonds to reimburse those expenditures. We pay in the short term out of our cash balances, and then we raise money through the issuance of bonds. The amount of bonding that we issue is has historically been based on the recommendations of this third-party technical advisory group called the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, or CDAC, which I'm sure this committee's heard of before. They were stood up, I think, about 20 years ago as kind of a best practice, and they are cited by national credit rating agencies as a best practice type of entity, so that how much borrowing we issue as a state is not a political decision. It's not the governor saying, oh, I think we should borrow this. It's not the legislature thinking we should borrow this. It's a neutral technical body. It's made up of representatives. It's got the treasurer's office takes a leading role in organizing that. Representatives from the administration are part of that committee. The legislative economist, the administration's economist is a non-voting member, or is not a member, but participates. I think the state auditor has been involved as a voting member in recent years. So it's a pretty diverse group of financial experts who get together annually, look at a variety of metrics through which the rating agencies determine our credit rating, and a host of other considerations. There's a whole statute on CDAC that I'd be happy to follow up if anybody is interested in more detail, spelling out a number of different items that they look at to determine basically how much debt can the state take on prudently, how much can we afford, and if we issue this much versus this much, what might the impacts be on our credit rating, on our affordability, or the debt service, potential debt service ramifications of those decisions look like. And so they issue a recommendation. They meet annually, but they issue biennial recommendations in line with the biennial capital bill. So they will come out and recommend, for instance, this year, $100 million as their sort of prudent cap. That largely will dictate the size, and historically has completely dictated the size of the capital bill. So if they say, we think we can prudently issue $120 million, that's typically the size of the capital bill, with some small exceptions I can discuss later. And the top line story with CDAC in recent years, so the states, their recommendation peaked at, I think it was FY14, FY15 at just under $160 million. It's my fourth bullet on the talking points. Borrowing there's been ups, there's downs. That sort of represents the high watermark of when the state was in the zenith of its zeal for borrowing. For many, many years, Vermont had a AAA rating from all three credit, or I think from at least two credit rating agencies, and then the second highest possible rating from the third. In the late 2000 teens, we were downgraded by those two credit rating agencies, down from kind of an A+ to an A or an A-, the second highest rating you could get. But the credit rating agencies cited a number of kind of concerning macroeconomic factors driving that. One is no stranger to anybody in this committee, Vermont's demographic challenges and our kind of stagnant economic outlook compared to other states and peer states in the region. Another major contributing factor to our credit rating, they look generally at our debt portfolio across all kinds of different categories. Our general obligation borrowing is one piece of that. Our unfunded pension liabilities are another really big piece of that. Those, in fact, eclipse our outstanding debt by quite a bit. Roughly speaking, and folks from the treasurer's office can correct me to the decimal point here, but our pension liabilities are in the order of $5 billion at this point. So this is a big nut that Vermont has been making steady progress to address. We contribute lots and lots of money annually in the operating budget towards those liabilities, but that's a big, it's a debt out there. And so citing that and the demographic challenges, the credit rating agencies downgraded us from AAA to AA+. And in some cases had some negative outlooks. All of that is cause for concern because our credit rating determines the price of borrowing. You know, it's like with your mortgage. And there are a number of really important reasons for Vermont to maintain as strong a credit rating as it can. So with that in mind and some other considerations, CDAC has been on a declining authorization or a declining, I should say, recommendation trajectory since that high watermark in FY14, FY15. Every year, their recommendations have either been lowered or level with the year before, down to the current recommendation of $100 million. And so if you do, I won't get into the weeds, but inflation, but CPI has risen about 35% in those 10 years. So if you do the inflation adjusted math of what $160 million was back then to now, I mean, it's more than an order of magnitude decrease that we've been on. And this, of course, coincides with skyrocketing capital costs and everything else. So our costs are going way up. Our CDAC recommendation has been going down for very valid reasons, and we probably need to continue on that trajectory. But all that being said, I mean, it doesn't take an economics whiz to figure out there's sort of an issue here with the capital bill. So I'll pause there just for a second. There's a lot of words, and I'm happy to take any questions, and I'll tee it up for next talking point. But
Other questions?
Overwhelmed.
Not yet.
Okay.
I have just a question on in the first bullet, you say the annual debt service payments, 70 to 80 million in recent years. Is that for all of the outstanding geo debt?
That's our aggregate debt service payment, correct? Madam Chair?
Okay.
So and that appears in the B1000, well, traditionally in the B1000 section, more recently as a transfer. But that's in the operating budget every year.
Okay. And so the pension liabilities, when I saw this at first, I was hoping that that was an old statement, but because I know 4 years ago or so, there was a major pension financing overhaul.
There have been several attempts over the last 20 years to kind of rein in our pension liabilities. And a whole another topic of conversation. But yes, in 2022, there was an Act 114, I think, that was sort of the latest effort at reining in some of our costs. We probably changed some of the employer, the structure of some of the pension reimbursements and whatnot. And it made a huge difference in terms of, we did a couple things. We also started pre-funding our medical benefits, which was a big piece. It increases in a very real way the amount of money you have to put into the system each year, which those payments are also made in the operating budget. But it reduces our long-term liability significantly because essentially you're capitalizing on potential gains in the market rather than paying all of your obligations as they come due in a pay-go system. So yes, we've made a lot of progress. There's still pretty significant liabilities. It's going to cost the state a lot of money, and we're on a trajectory to do that. But there's an amortization period of our unfunded liabilities, one for the pension systems, one for the retired teacher, retired healthcare benefits, for OPEB, other post-employment benefits. And the plan is to have those fully paid off by 2038 and 2048 respectively. But in that interim space.
Thank you. That's very helpful. You're right. Right. But we're going the right direction in that case, in that situation. Thank you.
Yes. And so that debt service piece, I think that's an important figure to highlight. So about 70 to 80 million dollars. Historically, in recent years, what that works out to be is a little bit over 4% of the overall general fund budget goes to paying debt service. I should have started with my favorite talking point, which is that at current rates, every dollar we go out to borrow costs taxpayers ultimately $1.50 over the life of a 20-year bond. So it's an expensive proposition.
150. Excuse me.
150.
150. Okay.
Taking it's at current interest rates. Of course, who knows what's going to happen with the feds, and these are all dynamic calculations, but it's an expensive proposition, bonding, and both in terms of annual cost with the 70 to 80 million dollars, and then that sort of return on investment piece. So, and just like you wouldn't I think most of us in our personal finances would rush out to put stuff on our credit card if we had money in our savings bank, savings account. For a while, given the declining CDEC authorizations, the increase in capital cost, and just this large looming question about bonding, we've been working on an alternative funding proposal for capital projects, which I think is sorely needed. And reading the writing on the wall in terms of the long-term future of this bill, it's clear that we're not going to be able to continue solely borrowing to meet our capital needs. So a couple of years ago, jointly, Treasurer Beth Pierce at the time and the administration proposed a mechanism to do that, the creation of what they called a cash fund. There have been a couple different titles. It's currently called the Cash Fund for Capital Projects and its Essential Investments, I think, something like that. But it's essentially kind of like a sinking fund, kind of like a pay-go model. It's basically, we've got cash in the bank. Instead of borrowing for capital projects, let's just pay with money we have and avoid these interest costs and those large long-term costs. And the idea, the sort of core of the concept was looking, all right, historically, we're spending about 4%, a little bit more of the general fund budget on our debt service costs. So we're spending about 4% of the general fund budget supporting our capital bill. And the idea behind the cash fund was to try to create this virtuous cycle whereby if we commit to a path or are led down a path following the CDAC recommendations of less and less borrowing over time, and presumably those debt service costs would lower over time, those aggregate debt service costs. How do we lock ourselves into a stable and sustainable portion of the general fund budget to support capital funding, but kind of recapture those savings, right? And that's what the cash fund does. So it takes, and it's offset towards the bottom of this talking point. There's an annual transfer mechanism that's codified in statute equal to 4%. There's that 4% of the total general fund appropriations in the last completed fiscal year, minus our current debt service obligations. So that's kind of what I described. You look at, all right, what was the sort of 4% benchmark last year? What are we anticipating we owe in debt service this year? Whatever that balance is, gets transferred into the cash. And that, if we can stay the course with declining authorizations or stable and sort of appropriate, given all of the context that I spoke about with regards to our credit ratings and stuff, our debt service amounts will continue to drop. And that transfer to the cash fund will continue to grow. And the less you borrow and the more you cash fund, then of course, the less you borrow. And it's this snowball, right, that we're really hoping to commit to. And in no time at all, in the next couple of years, the cash fund transfer under current models is projected to grow pretty significantly and could potentially eclipse capital general obligation borrowing as a major fund source for the capital bill. So it's something the administration feels really strongly about. The treasurer's office has also stood behind as a concept. This is certainly, if you're the state's banker, something good for books. I'd also mention this is a mechanism. It's not, as much as we'd love to take credit here in Vermont, we're not the only state doing this. There are lots of other states that are moving towards a pre-funding model or a pay-go model for capital projects. We are compared against them in the credit rating worlds, right? That's our universe of peers. So not only is it a good idea, but it's also a good idea just to kind of keep up with the times, right? And the treasurer and his staff, I'm sure, would be happy to testify to that and speak more in depth. But this is something that's a very high priority for the administration. I can't, of course, get into any detail of the capital budget that we'll be delivering in a couple of weeks, but I think it's fair to say you can expect the cash fund transfer to be fully funded at a statutory amount and factor significantly into our overall funding construct.
Senator Ingles.
So the problem has been, and I helped Senator Joe Benning, who was the chair at that time, and myself actually went and set up the first cash fund with Senator Kitchell. And we funded it with $10 million at the first time as the seed money to start that. And it's a great concept. And I'm going to call it a concept because it's better than a concept. It's great. But bringing cash into this building is like dropping a goldfish into a piranha pit. And it's been rated continually and it's been used everywhere else. I'm glad to hear that the treasurer is on board with that because it should bring some more protections maybe, because if he's for that, if that office is for that, it's great. I don't know how we're going to keep that fund from getting raided. It's very discouraging. It's going to be very discouraging to this committee because, as you've correctly said, our borrowing has gone down and gone down. Our obligations keep on going up. And so without the full support of all the funding mechanisms we can have in this committee, we're going to have to make a lot of tough decisions, and there's going to be a lot of general maintenance and a lot of other projects. We're just going to be a general maintenance committee. That's all we're going to be. We're not going to be able to fund all the things that make this committee great because we just want to. So I hope that we find a way to keep it from being raided.
May I respond, Madam Chair?
Yes, please. And then I have a similar question, but different.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought it up, Senator England. I mean, I think that's obviously we've sat through this process, many of us in this room for several years. The issue of the cash fund has been a topic of conversation. The issue of its jurisdiction is another, right, between whether these appropriations should be the jurisdiction of this committee or your colleagues across the hall, given the origin of the general fund transfer. I think I with full deference to the validity of everything you raised, Senator Ingles, I think from our perspective, this concept, which I would also point out, yes, there have been some adjustments made in prior years to the transfer amount, but I think largely, and this is credit to this body in general, the cash fund overall has been, I think, a success even so far in its 3 years of. I mean, I could go back and pull the total number of projects, but it's in the tens of millions of dollars. If you count cash fund B appropriations, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars for that one-time slug. So there have been adjustments. There have been slight disagreements around the edges about the amount. We'll certainly be putting forward a proposal that we think kind of secures and bolsters the commitment to the cash fund this year. But I think it's something that as a body, you all have been able to embrace. Certainly this body was the one to codify the cash fund. Notwithstanding some of those disagreements, there's been a lot of progress, and I think there's a lot of progress continued to be made. Which is great because I think the issues that I just spent 20 minutes describing are not going away, right? Which is why we're back here again, beating this drum, talking about the cash funds, because yes, there can be adjustments, there can be disagreements about purview, but as long as the state has buildings, to your point, Senator Ingles, we're going to need to maintain them. As long as we have policy priorities that require facilities, we're going to have to make investments in new facilities. And barring some other miraculous funding source falling from the sky, if any of you all can counter that, please let us know. At the Department of Finance and Management, we love money trees. We haven't found any yet in real life. Something's got to give, right? And we're going to have to figure out a way to fund this. And we really see this as our best bet to doing that. So I think my hope is, and we're of course committed to working with this committee and your colleagues across the hall to figure out, okay, and in an ongoing way, what makes sense in terms of jurisdiction and oversight, and how do we use this to the best effect for the state.
One quick follow-up.
Sure, let's go ahead. Yes.
Because I think we were lacking about $10 million out of that fund last year after it got done being rated. Maybe just a bit shy about that. And I do agree with you as far as the success of it. You can see the success of it. I am hoping that everybody can see the success of it and that it is instrumental because we don't go around taking anybody else's money as this committee. I'm hoping that everybody can have enough respect for the process and what's going on in Madam's chair's leadership that maybe there's a new way in this building, and I can only hope. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So I guess I'm looking at finding a more understandable way to frame the cash fund and the bonding money, because the way that I look on, this is last year's finished bill. It's the last page, and the cash fund is shown as funding in addition to the bond funding. So I would have thought that the goal of the cash fund is to not just supplement, but to replace some of the bond funding, right? Because we want the bond funding to go down. Or, what is the overall goal? I think it would be helpful to have dollar amounts before we have projects. Because at the end of last year, it didn't seem to matter that much which projects are in which categories, because they're getting funded. The project itself doesn't care whether it's
Right.
It's not impacted by whether it's bonded dollars or cash dollars. And a lot of the cash, most of the cash are capital projects. I want to say they all are, but
I think those are all
Yeah.
accurate statements,
So-
Madam Chair. Yeah. Your concern is having sort of clearly articulated what the long-term objective is with respect to resources.
that, and also just bringing the long term into our work, because decisions on which projects go in which categories of funding don't seem that relevant to me,
Right. So that's helpful.
or meaningful, I guess.
And I think that's intentional. When the cash fund was set up, there were conversations about, well, what kind of projects should this fund? And there had initially been some debate, well, maybe it should just be for sort of shorter term things, and the capital dollars, the bonded dollars with a 20-year payoff should be longer term. Eventually, those conversations kind of fizzled out, and it was determined, to your point, Madam Chair, that no, this is really meant to be an alternative funding source for capital projects. So there should be parity between what can be funded with bonded dollars and what can be funded with cash fund. There's some minor differences on the back end technical side in terms of how we roll out the appropriations. But to your point, there really is very little difference from a programmatic perspective, whether they get cash fund appropriation or not. So in terms of the long-term policy objective, at least from the administration, I think our hope is that us, Will and I, sitting in here today, and the time we spent in this committee last year describing our goal and our intention sort of helps frame that conversation. I think it's fair to say, in very simple terms, we will continue to present capital bills that are a mix of cash fund and a mix of borrowing. As to whether the cash fund will fully supplant borrowing, I think that intergenerational equity argument will continue to be in play. There's a diversity of opinions even among CDAC on kind of philosophically whether borrowing makes sense or not, or in what degree. So I think, I don't have a crystal ball any more than anybody at this table, but I think it's probably unlikely we'll get to a point where the capital bill has no borrowing. So that there's this kind of nuanced interplay between cash fund and borrowing. But I think our hope is that ratio, whatever size of the bill looks like over time, that will continue to shift towards the cap fund.
Right. And I completely agree with you that bonding makes sense in the long term, because a lot of times people will say, well, in my family, we wouldn't borrow if we had cash. But in the public sphere, we're not all related, and there are different people using the asset at different times. And so it's more fair to have that. Have you ever looked at 50-year bonding, or because many projects last longer than 20 years? Has that ever been considered to reduce the payments?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to speak authoritatively, Madam Chair, just because I haven't been here for 50 years.
Or 30 years, 40 years, but just a longer.
I believe that the current 20-year practice was set years ago that's been our historical practice for a variety of reasons. I mean, similar to your mortgage payment, better trade-offs and based on your term. Certainly it lowers your debt service obligations in the short term. You wind up paying more in interest the longer the term is. I think, given your point that there's a mix of capital assets that the state maintains and they frankly mature at different rates and sort of depreciate at different rates, 20 years has been kind of the sweet spot in terms of and since we generally don't pick out and say, okay, we're going to bond to reimburse ourselves for project X, but project Y, that'll be a different bond, right? They're all sort of aggregated. But actually, the treasurer's office might be a good entity to ask about.
Yes,
if there's
I plan to.
consideration.
Okay,
That's a good question.
good. Thank you. So I think you paused for questions, which was perfect. Thank you.
Great.
Any other questions? Or it keeps going. Okay,
I don't have much more on my formal talking points here, other than, I guess, sort of building off Senator Ingles's comments, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds of the history of what's happened over recent years, but it is fair to say that there's been some discussion about the cash fund. Again, we will be presenting a detailed capital bill with policy recommendations in a few short weeks here. So I don't want to jump ahead in that process, but I would just speak on behalf of the administration. I think we feel pretty strongly that the cash fund exists to fund capital projects, and that since its inception has been its purpose. Maybe I'll sort of parenthetically insert here. So the cash fund as proposed, as I've been describing, there's two sub accounts in the cash fund currently. A couple of years ago, in sort of a late stage in the legislative process, there was this second sub account added, into which some one-time money that's not part of this transfer formula was added. And that was to help leverage, primarily to draw down federal match that we knew we were going to get. It was IIJA money. In both the Agency of Transportation and the Agency of Natural Resources that we knew we were going to get. We had a large general fund surplus in that year. So we stuck some money aside, good Yankee financial sense there, to kind of set that money so that we could draw down, in some cases, like 12-to-1 federal match.
Senator Ingles mentioned that.
Yeah, I think that we had, at one time, we've had $17 million. And I apologize for the numbers, but I think we had $17 million that we had in here, and it got us to $160 million, something like that. And then there was another one, yeah. So, and then we did the same thing in transportation as well. I can't remember that number.
Those sound like the right orders of magnitude, Senator. Yeah. That was a great investment, certainly, and use of the fund. That second sub account, I think, moving forward, those are sort of extraordinary circumstances in the pandemic. That second sub account is probably unlikely to be a continued focus of the administration. It's great that it exists. It's a mechanism. We're really dialed in and focused on what we call Cash Fund A, but it's the first sub account, which is really this capital funding. And so that's my parenthetical insertion. What I was on the way to say is that we as the administration feel really strongly that this belongs in the capital committees of jurisdiction, with Representative Emmons and her committee, and with this committee as well, that you all are the ones that are really plugged into the granular details of capital projects and looking to to Chair Harrison's point, at the whole list of projects and balancing, what do we do? What do we cut? And so that it makes sense given that there's this parity between the cash fund and bonding, for you all to be the ones kind of weighing everything in a cohesive, comprehensive manner, and not, as has been the practice in a couple of recent legislative sessions, that the cash fund appropriations are made separately in the operating budget. Some of the concerns there, as members of this committee will, of course, know, is that there are very different timeframes for the operating budget development. The committee of conference process over there proceed very quickly. There's a lot of last minute changes. If this committee is having to wait on decisions being made over there that might impact the cash funds, it really complicates the work of this committee. And there's also some logistical pieces about the timing of the bills. I mean, typically the capital bill is effective upon passage and passes sometime in, late April or early May. If cap fund appropriations are made in the capital bill, those departments can turn around and start doing those projects late April, early May. For anybody that lives in Vermont knows that's prime construction season. That's something that's really important to get after. If we are having to wait for the passage of the big bill, which sometimes your conference committee is the very last bill out of the building, it's not effective until July 1st, typically. And even the uncertainty if there's a veto session and it's not until June that it's finalized, it kind of wastes half of that construction season and introduces an element of uncertainty into program planning that's pretty difficult for state entities. So we continue to think it's really important that it lives here. We are fully committed to working with the both committees of jurisdiction on the capital side and appropriations committees to kind of make that pitch and describe. I will say, since this has come up in years past, the appropriations committees will always retain control of the cash fund transfer amount, that 4% minus debt service that I was talking about. That will always happen in the D section of the big bill where fund transfers happen. So it's not like they're ceding any authority in terms of controlling the faucet of the general fund. What we are proposing is that faucet, once turned on, that bucket should go to this committee to decide how it's spent and not have projects sort of part of the larger appropriations mix with everything else, right? Which is this huge list. And it certainly, gosh knows, that committee gets a lot of input from a lot of different stakeholders. And so we just feel like there's this real value to having those processes be separate.
And just to your point, Nick, with the faucet metaphor, we also want to ensure that faucet stays fixed on and not turn partway, in changing this 4% number or permitting this 4% number to be mitigated. We see it as important to maintain a constant stream to the cash fund because we want to continue to grow and believe that as we decrease bonding, it will.
So constant from year to year. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Commit to this statutory
Right.
formula that's described. Yeah, it will change.
So then one kind of in the weeds question, but so you said section D, whatever. So if their bill isn't effective until July, how can their section D be effective earlier?
So it's a good question and a good catch, Madam Chair. There's a distinction here, I think, that's important, sort of in the weeds answer about spending authority versus fund balances. So if the appropriations were to be authorized in the capital bill prior to the passage of the big bill, that spending authority exists and departments can go out and fund those projects. Special funds in our accounting system are allowed to spend into deficit. So we of course maintain financial controls, but because of cash flow issues, it's not uncommon sometimes for a fund to spend into deficit. I would say, I mean, obviously there will always continue to need to be close communication between the chairs of these committees and appropriators. And if there was an understanding that at the last minute, their cash fund transfer was going to be reduced, then I think that would be certainly a talking point that you all would want to be in close communication about. But I think, and you'll see this as part of our ongoing recommendations, I think part of what we've been advocating for in our construct is actually statutorily committing to that cash fund transfer so that it's a law, that it's codified. I mean, this is the committee, this is the body that writes laws, right? So there's always notwithstanding language. Chair Evans loves to remind me of that every time I bring this up. But if we sort of as a state and as a body and an administration and a treasurer's office can all kind of get marching to be the same drum on this and commit to this concept, I think a lot of those concerns and some of the back and forth that we've seen in recent years can really be mitigated through that.
All right, that's very helpful. Save us some time too.
That's the hope. Always.
Time is precious. So this is a lot.
I would also.
That was a wonderful presentation.
I would also add that
Awesome.
this is probably the best duo right here to ask about the construct or if you're at all have any questions about the capital bill is because, you know, we're all learning it again. I mean, it takes a long time to learn it and, but these guys are the ones to say, hey, you know, and this is, what's this, what's that, how's it work? Because we're learning every bit more and more every day about how this thing lays out.
We're certainly around and available, very appreciative of the committee's time today. You will all likely see Will's face a little bit more often than mine, especially as the capital bill comes over. Will be in committee. Will is our BCS analyst, so has a lot of background in their operations and.
Yeah, I'll just briefly say, like, I've been the BGS portfolio holder since I came onto the state a few years ago. And the reason I'm here now is because I've taken over the treasury portfolio from Nick. So both of those departments are in my purview, and Nick is getting me up to speed on all this, so much as he's presented to you. And I'll try to make my presence here as much as possible for your information and to represent the administration's interests as well.
We're certainly always available and glad of any contact. I'll leave probably I think Chair Harrison has my phone number and contact information. Linda's got my email. Please don't hesitate to reach out at any point. And you'll be seeing more of us as we drop the
Definitely.
capital bill. I'll be back in here with granular feedback. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today.
Thank you. And you know
Appreciate
when
you
to find us.
Yeah.
Sometimes you know before we do.
So you guys are here.
Yeah, so any questions or comments? Okay,
Okay.
all right. Well, thank
Thank
you
you all.
very
Thank you all.
much. This is very helpful.
Pleasure to meet you, Will.
Likewise, Senator.
Yeah, let's-